Anyway, today I want to talk about culture and some of the reasons I think it's missing from current discussions on the Middle East. And I'll relate this problem to my two latest books, which were published in 2007 and 2009, as Kate said. The main reason for writing these books was to explore ways to put culture back on the agenda. And I was trying to do it for two very different audiences. One reason that scholars don't tackle this subject may be that culture is such a vague concept, meaning so many things to so many people. I'm clearly not talking about culture as art and local crafts, but rather about it as the shared ways people have for looking at the world. In other words, it's their conceptual framework that organizes their experiences and guides their behaviors. It includes their values, beliefs, and most of all, their expectations and assumptions about human relationships. Culture, like language, is a human capacity, and like language, it has rules that make communication easier. From my perspective, the best way to see culture is to watch people interacting with one another. And it means observing their behavior in a number of different contexts, from the way they deal with family members, outsiders, the rich, the poor, the elderly, and the young, and how they govern, marry, and bring up and educate their children, and basically how they react with one another in normal, everyday situations. My two books give examples of all these different contexts, which I've tried to immerse myself in over the years. We learned very late in Iraq and Afghanistan that we didn't understand Middle Eastern cultures very well. And yes, you laugh. And our ignorance probably lengthened both conflicts. Officials hope now to address the problem with sensitivity training, so the troops can win the hearts and minds of local people. But it may be too late and too little to make a difference. In a recent article in Vanity Fair, the author Sebastian Junger, who spent time embedded with troops in Afghanistan, praised the cultural sensitivity of American soldiers in dealing with Afghans as a result of their better training. This is what he observed. Yet the pictures that appeared in his article showed bare-chested American soldiers greeting local Afghans. And for anyone who knows that part of the world, they know how insulting that would be to Afghans. The soldiers and the author himself were simply unaware of how insulting it might be to the Afghans to be received by a half-dressed man. This may be a relatively insignificant incident, but my point is that most Americans don't realize how complicated it is to master the details of culture. John Kerry actually made quite an astute comment last year when he said it might be better to use trusted Afghans as intermediaries with village sheikhs, since they would stand a better chance of understanding the nuances of local behavior. There are at least three ways that our flawed understandings of Afghan culture meant we missed the implications of policy decisions we made in Afghanistan. The first was our insistence on a centralized government instead of a decentralized form that better fits the tribal nature of Afghan society. And in Ahmed Rashid's book on Afghanistan, you can find some of the what happened in the Loya Jirga that was held to decide on a government for Afghanistan. The second was our insistence on a presidential form of government instead of one that balanced presidential powers with a prime minister. Tribal societies traditionally balanced groups, so none became too powerful. And finally, we supported the writing of a constitution that met our definitions of democracy without fully understanding the implications of the Islamic clause that was added. It meant that any and all provisions in the Constitution could be overturned if a religious scholar simply said that it was incompatible with Islam. Consequently, the equality under the law provision, for example, is moot from the start. when the unequal gender provisions of Sharia law are applied. Although events in Afghanistan might still not have turned out well, they might have been better if more culturally appropriate institutions had been established. It's not much different for books and articles on foreign policy, scholarly and otherwise, that tend to take a similarly narrow view that fails to consider culture. Books on the Gulf, for example, always stress the economic and strategic importance of countries in the region, or they characterize them as rentier states, as if oil were the only factor shaping their political systems. But well before oil, leaders in the region demonstrated characteristic patterns of governing that continued long after the discovery of oil. A few scholars are beginning to complain about these distorted views, and one, an Iranian-American Fatima Kashvaris, in a book called Jasmine and Stars, accuses authors of many current books, such as The Kite Runner, Reading Lolita in Tehran, 9 Parts of Desire, and The Bookseller of Kabul, of a new kind of Orientalism. These authors, she said, position all evil on the side of the East and all good on the side of the West. The books stay on bestseller lists, she believes, because they affirm the preconceptions of their readers and make it easier for them to fight wars that bring the benefits of the West to the civilized East. Dr. Mervat Hatem, who was the ex-president of MISA, Middle East Studies Association, complains that many Arabs seeking reform have so assimilated Western values that they no longer see good in their own values, and consequently no longer speak for the majorities in their own countries. She cites the example of the UNDP's Human Resource Development Report written by Arab authors that she says don't question Western notions of development. There are other dilemmas for an anthropologist like myself wanting to write about culture. The first is a very legitimate complaint, and that's the danger in reducing cultural principles to a point where they are easily accessible to general audiences. Such oversimplification reduces the variations among and within communities. That way of writing, although popular in its day, was largely discredited with criticisms of Margaret Mead, who worked several decades ago. The second problem is a general distrust of government by many anthropologists who refuse to provide information that would make them complicit in what they see as a military occupation. A third factor is, of course, the writings of the late Edward Said, who 30 years ago criticized the Orientalist distortion of early Western writers. He claimed that they characterized the Middle East as either hopelessly primitive or worse, in overly romantic terms. His complaints have done much to suppress Western scholarly writing on the Middle East. Even if they're valid, they still, it has suppressed many of the, I've seen scholars who are reticent about talking about certain things because of these notions. A final deterrent has been the recent scholarship that focuses on universals in showing how alike we are rather than how different. The concept of cultural relativism, where each culture was measured by its own standards,